We're going to shift gears just a little bit here, and I don't know if people have seen this, but this is a graph of temperatures and CO2 in the atmosphere. And I was more freaked out about this before. I'm still fairly freaked out about it. But I mean, a couple things that are interesting here. You see the ice ages are in the low temperature ranges, and the peaks are interglacial periods. So this little flat here, relatively flat, is the last 10,000 years since the last ice age. What that tells me, partly, is that our agriculture has completely existed in that period right there. It's never known anything but that little totally stable blip. If you look, so it's not like people were just clueless and didn't discover agriculture back here. It just wasn't possible. And the other thing is, and look at this. These are the peaks of CO2 over the last, 800,000 years, 600 or 800,000 if you look at it. And then all of a sudden, bingo, we're way off the charts. I mean, I don't think anybody can predict what this means. What it does mean is that this little game down, this little stable period is over, and we need a level of resilience that we can't even imagine. So nobody has a plan for how to create a design for that necessarily, but I think that we can say a lot about what it does mean. We just need to be able to handle extremes on all ends, wet, dry, cold, hot, everything you can imagine, and be able to have plans, backup plans for that. So what does that really represent? In the beginning of this slideshow, I was talking about spirit rides the horse of matter. That carbon that was the spirits of all these animals, the great herds of animals, the bison and the passenger pigeons and the old growth forests and the 3/4 of our organic matter in our topsoil that's gone, it's up here now. And it's kind of haunting us from above, whereas that is, my present thinking is that is an opportunity. That's a feedstock. That's a feedstock that we can harness with photosynthesis and draw that back down into the places for all those beautiful beings that we looked at in the beginning, and rebuild those habitats and make space for creatures and the soil carbon sponge and all the pieces that it's going to require to move forward here. I'm not going to get into this too much other than to say that look at the size of the carbon bank in the soil compared to the atmosphere. There's lots of room for more carbon down here. So we can draw that down. What I'm going to get into next is that it's not quite the story we've been hearing. It doesn't appear to be in a good way. However, that high carbon dioxide is a real problem for ocean acidification. So we definitely need to draw it down. Anybody familiar with this guy, Michael Krapchik? I would recommend this book. It's, Water for the Recovery of the Climate, A New Water Paradigm. It's a very interesting perspective. And this and a man named Walter Jenne, who talking to Patrick about trying to get him down here, is I think he's unbelievable in what he's done for us in terms of really, breaking it down to a workable scenario. So what Walter is saying is that the heat dynamics, the reason why the planet is heating up is only about 5% from CO2 and methane. That close to 95% is from water. It's hydrology. There's 50,000 parts per million of water in the atmosphere, and it's something like 7 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas. It's very complex because water takes all these different forms. There's clouds and there's vapor and there's these hazes, and they all act differently. And so I'll give you a quick version. I spent 7 days with this guy in the past two years, and I'm just blown away by what he's really saying and what the opportunity is. So he's basically saying that 342 watts per meter of sunlight is coming in, heat, and 339 is getting back out. So there's 3 watts, or 1% of the sun's energy that's heating up the planet. So once you get it down to that, you can say, okay, how do we deal with 3 watts? It's just the beginning of being able to manage the problem. So there's a few places where there's real low-hanging fruit. And one of them is bare ground. Any kind of bare ground, unvegetated ground, because it's basically as low as 20 degrees centigrade and as high as 60 degrees centigrade. 20 degrees, depending on the vegetation and the density and the structure of the vegetation, and then bare ground or roads, rooftops, parking lots, etc., are up to 60 degrees centigrade. So that is 40 degrees extra that doesn't need to be happening. That's man-made, right? And that's where the rub is, because that comes in short wave, goes out long wave, temperature to the 4th power. As it tries to get out of the atmosphere, it's getting grabbed by all of the different things, the forms of water and the CO2 and the methane are grabbing it and holding on to it. So one of the things we can do, instead of worrying about greenhouse gases, and I'm not saying we shouldn't be thinking about them, but we can intervene with the temperature as it's being generated at the surface so that it doesn't even get up there, right? So that's one big way, is cover cropping. And this is really important for a whole bunch of other reasons when it gets into water, because water is what it's really all about. That what this guy is saying, that any given landscape, if the water is running off faster than it's infiltrating into the soil, it's going to have a fever. It's going to be heating up, it's going to be drying out. And when you're doing that, you're going to automatically get, so floods, droughts, and fire are all intimately related. You're going to get all of those from the same mismanagement of stopping water from infiltrating into the soil. Hugely powerful if we can get water to stay in the soil. So if we can do this over big enough areas, and I'll get to some things about measurement later, or some really incredible opportunities of how to pitch the economics of this whole thing, because we're at these tipping points right now that the 500-year floods are coming every 3 years, right? There's no amount of insurance money that can handle that. There's no amount of FEMA money that can handle that. It's a similar issue as autism going from 1 out of 1,500 is it to 1 out of 35 in the last 30 years, and it's supposed to be projected to be 1 out of 3 in the next 25 years or something. That alone would sink our economy. That's before you even get to diabetes and cancer and autoimmune diseases and heart disease. Yeah, so it's absolutely not an option. There's, it's ridiculous to have people arguing, Democrats and Republicans, about healthcare systems when there's no possible, even if the whole rest of the world wanted to try to take care of the United States, it couldn't be done economically. And so people like Zach Bush, as a doctor in Virginia, he realized as a doctor treating people holistically that he can't even touch the speed at which symptoms are being generated and doctors to be able to treat them. So he reached out and created this project called the Farmer's Footprint, where they've got I think it's a 5 million acre regenerative ag. He's working with Gabe Brown and others. And so they're linking doctors and farmers. And as we go forward, I'll talk more about that linkage in terms of nutrition. But the point I'm getting at is that the only real way forward here is to do prevention. Prevention for medicine, prevention for climate mitigation. Nothing else is going to work. I mean, you can see the writing on the wall. I don't know why anybody's even thinking otherwise with what we know. So basically, the draining of the land is, this guy, Michael Krapchik, he's talking about the small water cycle, renewal of the small water cycle, which is meaning, I think I got a slide. Okay, so this is the heat dynamics of, you can see a drained field. This is his version of what Walter Jenny is talking about, where this evapotranspiration, and this is clouds and cooling. Look at how much little that is and how much heat there is and how much heat there is here. So these are like temperature fluxes and reflectance and so forth, evapotranspiration. So that's his version of that. But this was something new to me. He's talking about the sea level rising because of the continents are all draining. 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, we had green soil carbon sponge in Australia, and not like real lush, but enough to have vegetation to be significant in this. And Australia, Sahara in Africa, the Tibetan Plateau, the whole Middle East. So we've got about half of the green that we did in that period. This is massively powerful if we can begin to regenerate vegetation on these places and start to sink, number one, create rainfall in a sense, because one of the things that's happening is that Welcher's laying out is that these hazes, for example, he's saying that there's 12 inches of rain potential in the Sahara, but it never rains because it doesn't go from haze particle to vapor. There's 1 million haze particles to 1 drop of water. So there's only 3 ways that happens, according to him. That over the oceans and along the coast, it's salt crystals from the ocean. High enough up in the atmosphere or far enough, toward the poles, it's ice crystals. And everything else is bacteria, and specific bacteria to what grows on trees and the stomata that open and close on the underside of tree leaves, and the sugars that are there, and the trees are able to get them up into the zone where they can nucleate haze particles into clouds. So clouds reflect about 50% of the heat, and hazes are basically drawing it all through, right? It's heating up and it's stagnating, and the pollutants, like in Asia, all the big cities, where this is happening, the water's not getting washed out. I mean, the pollutants aren't getting washed out of the air because it's not raining. But being able to shift the haze particles into clouds is massive on this temperature story. So there's all these different pieces, increasing clouds by something like 2 to 4% would be counterbalancing that 3 watts. By increasing 4% of evapotranspiration of basically the land mass of the world, and it would also compensate for that. So there's a lot of ways to get to the end point, and it's a combination of these factors. But trees seem to play in all of them. We shouldn't need that to have pointed out in a way, the tree of life and so forth. But he's actually showing how the numbers work. But this was new to me, that the continents are actually draining. As the water tables drop, where's all that water going? It's going into the ocean. So they're rising not just from ice melting, but from the small water cycle. So the small water cycle is basically water that's evapotranspirating from land and falling back onto land, not from the ocean to the land. There's the bigger, but that's the one that we've altered across the board, almost all over the world. We've been creating the conditions for droughts, fires, and floods. They all are part of the same continuum. So creating this soil carbon sponge is the end game. And if you can get water to infiltrate into the soil, and this is why mycorrhizal fungi, on top of everything else that we're talking about, is so key, is that it's opening up, it's creating the pore spaces, it's creating those cathedrals in underground. It's not about the stuff that it's made of, but the spaces that they're created with the glomalins and then all the exudates from the plants and that beautiful symbiotic synergistic thing that's going on there when you get this two-way bidirectional flow between the soil and the plant. And there's this fascinating thing that's kind of forming in my head right now of kind of an analogy. And it's so when a plant is getting everything it needs from the soil, mineral-wise, biological-wise, it bumps up to a higher level of health and vitality to where it can share a much larger percentage of its photosynthetic energy with the soil, like 50 to 60%. But a plant that's not getting its needs met holds back. Not only holds back, but will create allelopathic chemicals to start suppressing the plants around it because it needs that territory. And so then if you project that to the next level of the animal that eats that plant, so if an animal that eats a plant like almost everything in our stores, which is, really low. I mean, if insects are going after it, it's not up to speed. That plant couldn't take care of itself. It wasn't making the secondary compounds that they could protect themselves, which means that, and that's what you're seeing in the bricks and some new tools now that we're looking at. But say the animal eats a really healthy plant, say it's a person, because this is really one of the limiting factors I'm seeing. I was starting to say earlier, but the too young, too old, too sick, too far in debt. Where's this team of people that's going to do all this work once we figure out exactly how many watts we need to cool and how many riparian zones and how many acres worldwide we need to get trees planted and all this other stuff. I'm seeing like New Green Deal like on steroids with a Homestead Act for getting young people access to land after, say, 5 years of planting the daylights out of all these landscapes that we can show, here's how we take care of those 3 watts and so on and so forth. But we not only have to get the policies changed and the money to line up, but we need to get the mitochondrial energy of the human being up to speed. Mitochondrial energy and the epigenetics that has gone way down the tubes. People familiar with Francis Pottinger's work? It's looking awful lot like we're 3 generations into a 4-generation endgame. But the good news is that can be turned around. I was going to mention that during the seed part, but what we're seeing with annual plants is really pretty tremendous, in 3 years, because it's 3 to 4 generations, right, to go from one end to the other, potentially. And we're seeing massive changes in the seed size and health and the results of planting it in very little time with minerals and biology and healthy soil compared to all these crops without it. And so the only way to get to this prevention story about human health is to way up the game on nutrition. The one benefit of annuals is we're way over relying on them, and we need to really shift all systems to a much higher level of perennial base. But you can see the further away you get from the further north and the further south you get, away from the equator, it's dazzling how much you can get done with annuals in a short productive window of long day length. Okay, so there's this draining of the continents. We need to get the soil carbon sponge to hold the water, to infiltrate that water, because if it's running off, it's taking our soil with it, and it's causing this fever in the larger system. And basically so the biodiversity that's what we really need to do. It has to have water. To increase biodiversity, you better have water. But the thing is, you get this whole cascade effect of, when you have more biodiversity in a system, your biomass goes up, your photosynthesis, carbon intake, oxygen production, organic matter, nutrient cycling, fertility, infiltration, retention of water, soil moisture, relative humidity, and positive changes in the climate picture. But water is key to all of that, and soil is key to the water, and vegetation is key to the soil. So all these things have to fit together nicely. So before Europeans came, or when Europeans came to this continent, there was between 80 and 300 million beaver, and there was something like 2.7 million gallons of water per beaver. So the amount of hydration on this continent was stunning just from beaver alone, and then all of the other ecological niche management that these guys were doing. You can just see a landscape with a lot of hydration from beavers. Now, this isn't the only way to do it, but we can learn from them, we can emulate them, and we can do lots of other techniques.